Is this the end of Boris Johnson? That is a question that is being floated in UK politics and amongst Britons. The Prime Minister is facing the biggest challenge to his premiership as the partygate scandal has snowballed into a political nightmare for him. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at whether the Prime Minister has any magic tricks up his sleeve to save his position and whether his party can actually survive this blow, while the Labour Party's popularity has increased as a result. Paul, to get the latest on this, first we're going to cross on over to London and talk to our correspondent, Amina Taylor. Amina Taylor, what are we looking at here? I'm looking at front page headlines that does not bode well for the Prime Minister. I'm not too sure which one to ask you about as we're looking at all these different really harsh rhetoric coming from these headlines. You tell us what's standing out right now for Boris Johnson and then for the people there in the UK, how they feel about him.
Well, Calvin, we're clearly in the containment section of this operation from the Conservative Party, because it was clear that the deny, and then lie stage was proving to be ineffective. Once photos had been released of the latest party that was taking place during the May 2020 lockdown, this is after we had already had news of the one in December. And then to just add misery on top of insult, on top of disbelief, this party that took place on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral. So with all of this in mind, I think what the Tories are trying to do here is to rally the troops, to go with the position that the Sue Gray inquiry, which is, of course, the civil servant who is in charge essentially of marking the government's homework here on this one. Let's wait to see what she has to say and then we make a move. But if Keir Starmer is correct here, it is very difficult to see how the Prime Minister can say he did not break protocol. And if you break protocol and then you're found to have lied about it, it's very difficult to see how you can stay in your position. I think the only thing that is saving Boris Johnson from having to walk the political plank now is the fact that nobody with any real credibility wants the job as the head of the Tory party at the moment. Rishi Sunak is the man they're touting. He wouldn't want to touch this dirty basket right now. He'd want to wash his hands until the next election, then swoop in. And Labour, they know this as well, Kaveh. Okay, and
before I let you go, just very quickly, if you can, this Operation Save Big Dog, which points to government restructuring, is that accurate? Is it true, or is it just rumors?
It is ludicrous, but I think the idea here is that Boris Johnson is a useful tool for them at the moment. There are still parts where he is liked, but they recognize that it would be electoral suicide for them to get rid of him now, especially with Labour ahead in the polls. So keep him in until we can get a guy and we can distance ourselves from this scandal.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Amina Taylor there, correspondent from London. Thank you for the latest on this. Let me introduce our guests for this edition of The Spotlight. We have John Wight. He's a writer and political analyst joining us from Edinburgh. Also joining us, Hughes, journalist and political commentator, who joins us from Belfast. Very well, welcome to both of you. John Wight, let me first start with you. When I asked our correspondent about the latest, she went through the events, which may be in a sense overlooked by people who are not so familiar, because we're looking at an explosive set of events that happened one after the other regarding these numerous parties and the way that the government reacted to it, which then, if you take a line to the side of that, is filled with lies, it's filled with silence. Perhaps you can tell us how that does not bode well for the people who are in power. Or maybe their days are numbered at this point.
Well, just like the US under Trump, under Johnson, Britain is in a post-truth scenario when it comes to its politics. Boris Johnson is a proven liar. He's a rogue. He's a man for whom integrity is a foreign land. And he seems quite astonishingly impervious to the extent of the anger of the British public over these revelations, which are coming fast and furious by the week of further parties that were taking place in and around Downing Street during lockdown. We're hearing now there were regular Friday night wine nights among his staffers and people who work there and work with him closely in his office. So it is quite astonishing the extent not only to which he seems impervious to the consequences of these actions during strict lockdown, when people all up and down the UK were denied the right to be with loved ones on their deathbeds or be with loved ones for months and months on end because of the regulations and the rules that were passed by his government. And he was standing at the rostrum articulating the new regulations as they came in. People couldn't mix, they couldn't see family members, etc., etc. But the Tory party seems to be intent on circling the wagons. Operation Big Dog says it itself. If Al Capone did politics, he would be on the side of Boris Johnson. He doesn't care about public opinion. He thinks he can tough it out. He is a creature of entitlement and privilege. And you get to see how this story is going to run, because what he has done is he's managed to unite the UK media from left to right in anger and splenetic rage at the extent to which his government and people working for his government were flouting lockdown rules throughout 2020 and 2021.
Sure. Well, we're going to get into the way that Boris Johnson has conducted himself when it comes to politics. Some say that's his asset, but in this case, we're not sure about that. But Frau Hughes, I have to ask you this about how you have these parties, one after the other, to bring your booze party, which really then ticks people off. I don't want to beat the events to a pulp here, but when it came to that party that was held the night before the funeral of Prince Philip, well, that also struck a nerve with many people there in Britain, especially when you have the picture of the Queen by herself to sit alone due to the coronavirus restrictions. Did that push this whole thing over the edge with that happening? And how badly or severely did that affect public opinion against Johnson?
Well, I think firstly we'll have to maybe acknowledge the fact that there appears to be a campaign to undermine Boris Johnson's premiership. The fact that these leaks are coming thick and fast, one after the other, it appears orchestrated to put pressure and mounting pressure onto Boris Johnson and his cabinet with ongoing further allegations of these parties. I suppose when it comes to Prince Philip, a lot of the British people are monarchists. I mean, a lot of the tabloid media and a lot of people really from kind of when they're born into the British United Kingdom system are brought up to revere with adulation the royal family. So the fact that they were partying the night before the funeral of Prince Philip does indicate a kind of abject negation of responsibility by those in charge. I mean, normally that funeral would have been huge. The military display that would be attendant to the funeral, all the monarchy there in their regalia and their splendour, seeing off Prince Philip. I think it just proves that there is a genuine disconnect between those who run the country, those who see themselves as entitled, and the elite, the people who have been to the various public schools and the public school upbringing, that they've had these multi-millionaires who claim to be in touch with the common people. I think the disregard shown by Boris Johnson and all those who attended maybe proves two things. One thing is, if it wasn't for the leak, we wouldn't know anything about this, and it would be just a continuation of Boris in power.
Who do you think is responsible for the leaks coming out? When we know the first one, I mean, you're saying that there are successive leaks coming out at this pace that's somewhat not ordinary. But the way the government handled it is obviously also not professionally handled. So that's another aspect of this. But let's move on. And I'm sorry to jump in because I'd like to move on to how there is now a call from within Johnson's party. John Wight, 6th Conservative MP, calling for the Prime Minister to quit. We have estimated, based on our sources, 20 may have submitted letters to, I guess, what's called the 1922 committee, well short of the 54 needed, however. And you talked about Operation Save Big Dog. Is that Boris Johnson's way of trying to get out of this?
Well, we're waiting for the conclusions of Sue Gray, the civil servant who's been tasked with investigating the leaks, the parties, etc., which her conclusions are said to will be published at the end of next week. A lot of Tory MPs are following the line of let's wait for the conclusions to her inquiry while they're not supporting Johnson, but just following protocol. But I'm quite surprised there's only 20 letters gone into the 1922 committee thus far, given the extent of the breaches of lockdown. These MPs will be under huge pressure from their constituents. There are local elections coming up in May. This will be a very telling measure of the extent of public opinion in regards to Johnson. The latest opinion polls has Labour 14 points ahead. I still think Boris Johnson curries some favour amongst especially Red Wall, the North, his new working class base vis-a-vis Brexit. He's seen as more relatable, certainly, than Keir Starmer. Mm-hmm. He likes a drink, he likes a laugh. He's a guy who's prone to scandal. He's got a sense of humour, and that plays well with a lot of people in the country, who feel disconnected from the usual machine politicians such as Keir Starmer. My surprise is that Labour is not further ahead than 14 points, given the extent of these breaches of lockdown, especially, as you just touched upon with Fra Hughes, regarding the party that was held the night before the Queen attended her husband's funeral almost on her own and obeying lockdown rules. So we're yet to see what's going to happen next week. Sue Gray's conclusions, her report will be key in determining the fate of Boris Johnson. He's going to tough it out. Don't forget that Sue Gray is a Johnson appointee, as is Cressida Dick, the head of the Met Police, and there's been a harsh light shone on her for her inaction so far and willing to investigate previous breaches that have come to light with regards to Johnson and his administration.
Okay. We don't want this, and I'm trying not to make this a Boris Johnson bashing 25-minute block here, but we need to talk about his behavior, Fra Hughes, and I'm going to use the words of a Shoreham MP that I'm sure you're familiar with, Tim Loughton, who has said, the reason for my conclusion in calling for him to stand down is the way that this is handled, and he described it as, quote, obfuscation, prevarication, and evasion to have been the order of the day. Do you agree?
Yes, it's a very good description, and it's very apt and it's very to the point. First, he denied the allegations. In fact, I think he denied them twice before eventually coming to the fore with the latest information put out into the public domain. He's admitted that he was there. What we're witnessing is Boris Johnson's. It's partly, I think, his personality. He's a bit of a bluffer and a blagger, and somebody will just manipulate and the truth in order to sell himself to both the public and the party. I feel that he's been caught out telling fibs. He's been caught out with his finger in the cookie jar, or perhaps the drinks cabinet in this particular instance. But I think he has told or been economical with the truth in the way he's handled this. So there's a bit of buffoonery there. There's a bit of he's admitted that he's made mistakes, but I don't think it's enough to make him go, because I don't think there's enough will within the Conservative Party to throw him under the bus. I do think there's an opportunity, if he can see this through, he'll be there until at least May, when they have the local elections, and see how he finishes after that.
Okay, well, on that, John Wight, what has Boris Johnson done? I mean, really, if you think about it, he's the one that perhaps gained his notoriety, in a sense, from Brexit, the deadlock that gripped the UK for so many years, if not the whole world, in a sense. So, aside from that, can you tell us?
Well, nothing really. He's gains a lot of credit from Brexit. He's completely mishandled COVID in the UK. 150,000 COVID dead tells its own story. He was too slow to lock down, and when he did lock down, over 2 months after China locked down in January of 2020, he didn't lock down hard enough. He has been known to have said, let the bodies pile high, when he was faced with the prospect of having to implement another lockdown. And so, it's surprising to me that he hasn't been forced out of office up to now. The PPE scandals, the High Court in London just recently judged that his VIP lane, so-called, giving PPE contracts to Tory donors and so on the pretext of COVID, was illegal. So this is an administration, a government that's mired in scandal, illegality, lies, obfuscation, as you mentioned, and just being economical with the truth. There seems to be no lie that he won't tell, his ministers won't tell, in order to bolster their position. So the corruption is deep and it's unending. So, he is a rogue prime minister, probably in a long line of such. And it's remarkable to me, as I say, that he's not been forced out of office. I just think this reflects a debased political culture in the UK surrounding Brexit.
Sure. Well, on the line of what you said earlier, Fra Hughes, I'm going to go with 2 viewer comments here. One, so our politicians lied to us? What a surprise. The real news here is that government officials never have taken the COVID threat seriously. The big question is, why should we? And the next viewer comment, I think it's shocking that Johnson may force subordinates to resign and not himself. The boss carries the responsibility. Boris Johnson is not the ideal PM, but if he resigns, I see no credible candidates to replace him. Should we look at Boris Johnson, the man, and separate him from the party, or are they both in this thing together?
Well, first of all, he's leading the party. And secondly, I mean, there was an invitation to perhaps, was it 100 people to bring your own and have the party in the Downing Street gardens. And only 30 people turned up. That's telling in itself. That, you know, would imply that 70 people who were invited said to themselves, no, I don't think this maybe is a very good idea. Don't think it's maybe very appropriate under the circumstances with what else is happening with COVID regulations in the country. As I've said, Johnson's leading the party, so he has ultimate responsibility for whatever he does as an individual and also as the leader of the party. But he's got a huge majority. There aren't any elections, meaningful elections outside of the council elections until 2024. He's not going to resign. I mean, there's no way someone with that personality who's been able to get himself to the top of British politics is just going to fall on the sword. And he won't go unless he's pushed. And I can't see there being a groundswell of people within the Conservative Party looking rid of Boris Johnson at the moment. And I completely agree with John. I mean, we are just seeing the tip of the corruption iceberg that is British politics. And it's not just British politics. It's all the neoliberal governments across Europe and in America. They're up to their necks in graft, and they're paid for by corporations, and they treat the rest of us, especially the voters, with disdain. They only care about us once every 4 years when we go into the polling booth and put our X against someone's name. And normally It isn't a name, normally it's a party. And with the two-party system we have, both moving further and further to the right, working class people in Britain will suffer for decades to come, regardless of whether or not Boris Johnson's in power this time next year.
Well, you know, when you take a look at what's happening in the world right now, John Wight, I mean, we're looking at Europe, in particular NATO and the US and the way that they're confronting Russia. We're looking at our part of the world where we get sanctioned every other day, practically, and other world events that shape the world in one shape or another in a major way. That we're looking at the UK and parties where you have to bring your own alcohol. So when you have being the UK trait right now and how it's made headlines, perhaps what I'm looking at here was a quote that was made by a particular MP that says, what we're seeing right now is the culture at 10 Downing Street that is necessary for it to change. What is this culture of 10 Downing Street that requires a change in it, if you agree with that?
Well, it's like the dying days of Rome. We're seeing these parties in Downing Street with people, procuring suitcases full of wine, cavorting in the Downing Street gardens, flouting lockdown rules and regulations at the same time as the morgues were filled up with COVID dead. NHF nurses and clinicians were at breaking point, suffering PTSD, dealing with the consequences of COVID. It's at the height of the pandemic in the UK. It's really redolent of the dying days of Rome. And Fra touched on something very important when he mentioned the word neoliberalism. This is a product of late capitalism. This is a demise of the West on a broader level. And these politicians like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump are a product of those dying days. They are the corruption that a corrupt political system produced. And I see this as a very serious inflection point in global politics. The UK coming out of Brexit, that was a last gasp, a death rattle of British imperialism, thinking that resorting to nationalism, Union Jack flag waving can deal with the problems wrought by neoliberalism in a time of crisis. The wrong lessons have been learned from the financial and economic crash of 2008, and neoliberalism is a corpse, and it's a putrefying corpse that needs to be buried. Boris Johnson is not the man to bury that corpse. Neither is Keir Starmer. So we're looking at the demise of the UK as a state, And I look forward to the day that it breaks up, because it's on the way of breaking up. It has no answers to the challenges of the 21st century. And Boris Johnson is a product of the same apparatus as Keir Starmer is. Nothing good can come of either of those two men in power for the UK to remain a unified state.
Sure. Well, I was going to talk about Keir Starmer, but I don't know, after what John Wight said there, I should get into that. But I have to, because it regards the ratings, where you have obviously Boris Johnson's ratings to plummeted, and we're looking at Labour actually to pretty much on the back of this gained 41% of the vote share based on one particular poll. I don't know if you're a fan of polls there, Hughes. This one by Opinium, putting Labour on 41% of the vote share, Conservatives at 31%. Is there a chance for Labour to come on? I mean, we're looking obviously at Keir Starmer at this point heading that party, but is he, as he says, perhaps somebody that could act in the public interest should he resign, in reference to Johnson?
I think in truth and in honesty, what we'll have is we have a two-party system, the same as they do in America and most of Western Europe. So what happens is when the incumbent government or the Prime Minister becomes a failure or is shown through his actions to be incompetent or uncaring, what we have is the pendulum that swings once upon a time from the Conservative right wing to the Labour left wing. And then with Tony Blair, obviously he brought New Labour to central politics, and I would say that Starmer is a devotee of Tony Blair's politics. It's funny that Margaret Thatcher's kind of best outcome was the election of Tony Blair. So I think what we have now, if you're looking at Starmer as someone who is a real challenge to Boris Johnson, I don't think he is. I think he's a complete lightweight. I think with the destruction and the destroying of the reputation of Jeremy Corbyn, there's a lot of people who are traditional Labour voters who will not vote Labour under Keir Starmer. And I think what we have is we have a Tory-light prospective Prime Minister in waiting.
Let me jump in here quickly, because we're fresh out of time, and ask John Wight the last question. John Wight, you said how even the two parties here are not suffice to deal with what the UK has to deal with, and one of the issues that are at the top of the agenda for any country now is how to deal with COVID, how to make sure economic progress is going to be made, amongst all the other issues that are involved when it comes to the UK. So what are we looking at in terms of the UK's future here? How it's going to grow out of COVID when you have these scandals bringing down the current government, as it appears?
Well, COVID, in one sense, has been a political distraction from the problems surrounding Brexit, because all the new regulations that are going to come into force regarding Brexit come into force by the summer. So we're going to see real chaos at the ports. There's still the issue of Ireland and the border down the Irish Sea, and we're seeing a push towards Irish unity, such as we haven't seen since partition in the early 1920s. We're seeing a huge upswing in support for Scottish independence. And all the while in England, they seem to be turning more and more insular in terms of their politics, in terms of the culture wars that are being unleashed there by Brexit. It's unleashed, to my mind, the forces of racism. Britain is no longer a major power, but it's trying to masquerade as one, and it's always been able to do so under the umbrella of US hegemony. But since coming out of the EU, the UK is now seen as an important ally to the US as it was hitherto. And so we're yet to see how this will play out in global terms. Johnson is an embarrassment. There are multiple crises that face Britain right now, including foreign policy, including economics, including the fallout from COVID, including trade, etc., etc. So this is a distraction, and I think at some point, Tory MPs, backbenchers, will have to look at their own position with regards to their constituents. Because the election comes in 2024. On this trajectory, the Tories will lose their 80-seat majority. We'll see Keir Starmer as the new Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. John Wight there, thank you for your contribution. Writer and political analyst from Edinburgh, and Hughes, journalist and political commentator from Belfast. That does it for this edition of The Spotlight. Thanks for tuning in. Any questions or comments? Newsroom@presstv.ir. That's our email address. From me, the entire team, it's goodbye. Until next time.